Welcome back to Domain 4 of the Security Plus Exam Cram Series 2024 edition. And here in Section 4.3, we'll focus on vulnerability management. We'll begin with a look at how we identify vulnerabilities through activities like vulnerability scans and penetration tests. And we'll unpack the different types of scans and tests that are available to us and their advantages in a variety of scenarios. We'll then dig into the analysis phase and how we prioritize and score our findings so we make better decisions around remediation and risk management. We'll then dig in to the validation phase and all the ways we can validate our remediations were successful before we roll all this information up and report our findings back to our organization stakeholders. Operational knowledge here that can absolutely set you apart from the crowd. Let's dig in. Welcome back to Domain 4 of the Security Plus Exam Cram Series 2024 edition. And here in Section 4.3, we're going to focus on vulnerability management. More specifically, the syllabus asks us to explain various activities associated with vulnerability management. And what you will see in the syllabus is a long list of identification methods, the analysis phase, vulnerability response and remediation, validation of our remediation, and reporting. What you may not see within this very long list is the vulnerability lifecycle. Maybe not obvious, but it's hidden here. Identification, analysis, response, validation, and reporting. So let's start with a quick walk through that lifecycle, and then we'll dig into the details here. So the vulnerability lifecycle has those 5 phases: identification, analysis, response and remediation, validation of our remediation, and then reporting. Identification can come from a number of sources, from vulnerability scans, penetration tests, responsible disclosure, bug bounty programs, even audit results. In analysis, we're confirming the vulnerability, prioritizing it using the CVSS and CVE metrics, and considering organization-specific factors. Responses might include applying patches, isolating affected systems, implementing compensating controls, even transferring risk through insurance, or formally accepting that risk. Validation ensures the vulnerability is no longer present, and in the reporting phase, we inform stakeholders about our findings, the actions we took, trends, and recommendations for improvement. Now, vulnerability scan is the first item on the agenda here in the syllabus, but we're going to take a step back and look at some important terms as they relate to the bigger picture of vulnerability management. Vulnerability management includes routine vulnerability scans and periodic vulnerability assessments. It's really the program level focus. The vulnerability scanner can scan the network, detect known security vulnerabilities and weaknesses, the absence of patches or weak passwords, and that scanner that performs the scan is basically used to conduct a vulnerability assessment, which extends just beyond the technical scan and can include reviews and audits to detect vulnerabilities. So the assessment gives us generally some additional information, some human review, and provides a bit of context to the technical output of the vulnerability scan. So we know the vulnerability scan can help us identify and report various vulnerabilities before they're exploited, but what do we see in that scan output? There's going to be a variety of information in here, from software flaws, missing patches, open ports that perhaps shouldn't be open, services that should not be running, weak passwords. It's identifying the attack surface that opens the door to known attacks like SQL injection, buffer overflows, denial of service, other malicious attacks that are known. And vulnerabilities reported in scan output will be prioritized based on severity and relative likelihood of the vulnerability being exploited, and typically the security team is going to weigh in on severity and priority because they have a good understanding of the organization's security posture, the security controls that are in place. Because in a zero trust strategy where we have defense in depth implemented, things that look severe on a vulnerability scan may actually not be a great threat. And that scan output is typically going to include the CVSS number, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System result, and the CVE, which is the Common Vulnerability and Exposure item. And the information we get here can also help in our prioritization. If you're not familiar with CVSS and CVE, we'll be revisiting those in greater depth later in this session. But first, I want to talk to you about the different types of vulnerability scans. While they all have the same high-level goal of assessing possible security vulnerabilities on our computer endpoints, our networks, and our equipment, there are a few different flavors you should be familiar with. For example, the credentialed scan, which is a more powerful version of a typical vulnerability scan, because it has higher privileges than a non-credentialed scan, but can basically spot vulnerabilities that require privilege, login credentials. And of course, the non-credentialed scan has lower privileges than the credentialed version, and it will identify vulnerabilities that an attacker would easily find. It can find missing patches, some protocol vulnerabilities that can more or less be discovered anonymously. We have non-intrusive scans. These are passive and they merely report vulnerabilities. They don't cause damage. We have the intrusive scan that can cause damage as they try to exploit the vulnerability, and they should be used in a sandbox and not on your live production system. Then we have the configuration review. So a configuration compliance scanner or desired state configuration in PowerShell can be used to ensure that no deviations are made to the security configuration of a system. But by combining these different techniques, we can reveal which vulnerabilities are most easily exploitable in a live environment. We have network scans. These scans look at computers and devices on your network and help identify weaknesses in their security. That's just a common vulnerability scan. We have application scans. So before applications are released, coding experts perform regression testing that will check code for deficiencies. This will typically involve a dynamic scanning technique that injects unexpected values into forms and so forth to make sure that the application is validating input before it submits. Checks for any other unsecure coding practices. Then we have web application scans. So these will crawl through a website as if they're a search engine looking for vulnerabilities and may perform an automated check for site or application vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting and SQL injection. There are a number of very sophisticated web application scanners available due in part to mass adoption of cloud computing. Now we'll move into the application security category, and we'll start with static analysis. Sometimes called static code analysis or static application security testing, it's analysis that examines the code without executing it. And of course that requires access to the source code. Then we have dynamic analysis, sometimes called dynamic code analysis or dynamic application security testing, which is code analysis that checks the code as it is running. Fuzzing is a testing strategy that falls into the dynamic analysis category, and it tests the application's ability to handle unexpected or malicious input gracefully. And it does not require source code access. It's sometimes said that static analysis tests the software from the inside out, and dynamic analysis tests the software from the outside in. And package monitoring refers to tracking third-party and open-source libraries or packages used in your organization and monitoring those for known vulnerabilities or for the need to update, for example, new versions. It ensures libraries are patched, versions are up to date, leaving us exposed to a minimum number of preventable vulnerabilities. Now we're going to move into threat feeds, so threat intelligence sources essentially. There are open source options that enable organizations to conduct cyber threat intelligence gathering free of charge, like threatcrowd.org and openfish.com. There are quite a few you'll find if you do a simple Google search or join any security community out there. Then you have closed or proprietary threat feeds, and these are vendor-specific threat intelligence feeds limited to paying customers, which are intended to keep customers informed while not tipping off threat actors. And again, a number of vendor-specific feeds. Tenable, Security Focus, Rapid7. So Tenable and Rapid7 both make vulnerability scanners that I quite like, but again, a number of sources. And then we have vulnerability databases like Shodan that allow you to search for vulnerabilities. Shodan in particular exposes a wide variety of vulnerabilities, from expired certificates to unsecure cameras. And while it's normally an annual fee, you'll find some sales that come up every now and again that allow you to buy a lifetime membership to Shodan for as little as $5. And then we have the National Institute of Standards, or NIST, who maintains a comprehensive database of vulnerabilities. It's called the National Vulnerability Database, and it keeps within that database a list of common vulnerabilities and exposures. We're going to unpack CVEs and CVSS here in a moment. And NIST being the most commonly used, it's not the only game in town. MITRE maintains a very comprehensive CVE list, and then you have the vulnerability database at vuldb.com. And this world is always evolving. There used to be an open source vulnerability database, OSVDB, that shut down a few years ago. Another source are public and private information sharing centers. These are programs, groups, and feeds designed to share cyber intelligence in various forms to both government and commercial organizations around the world. A good example here is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA for short, which is an agency of the U.S. government that maintains a list of information sharing centers. CISA performs a variety of functions, an invaluable resource for security professionals, but you can start at that link and have a look. And then there's the dark web, which is an overlay to the existing internet that requires specialized software to access private websites. There's extensive information to gather from the dark web, including the activities of hacker groups. The dark web is typically accessed with a Tor browser, where you visit websites with a .onion extension. A number of ways to do it. Proceed with caution. Do your research before you attempt to access the dark web. I've mentioned indicators of compromise in passing a time or two, also called threat indicators. They're pieces of forensic data, like data found in system log entries or files that identify potentially malicious activity on a system or network. They indicate malicious activity may be in progress. I want to pause for a quick sidebar with you here to speak to the question of what is a threat intelligence feed, sometimes called a threat feed at the most fundamental level. It is essentially a continuous stream of data about potential cyber threats. The data is collected from various sources, and it's formatted to provide security professionals with actionable intelligence. And that formatting is also done to make that feed consumable. More on that in a minute. But think of it like a real-time news feed, but instead of news articles, it delivers updates on the latest cyber threats. And what's included in a threat feed? Well, it varies by provider, but it can include indicators of compromise, threat actor information, as well as emerging threats, what we'd sometimes call zero-day threats. How are these feeds consumed? Well, some are machine readable. There's formatting we'll talk about called taxi and sticks. I'll unpack those with you in a minute. And others are human-readable feeds that are delivered via email, dashboards, or other reports. And there are a number of benefits here, but perhaps most importantly, threat feeds can help organizations stay ahead of the latest threats, providing early warning, improved detection, and allowing them to make more informed decisions. Okay, back to threat intelligence sources. There's automated indicator sharing, which is a CISA capability that enables real-time exchange of machine-readable cyber threat indicators and defensive measures. It's provided free to help participants in the AIS community and ultimately to reduce the prevalence of cyber attacks. If you're interested, you can read more at cisa.gov/AIS. And then we have TAXI, which is short for Trusted Automated Exchange of Intelligence Information, which defines how real-time cyber threat information can be shared via services and message exchanges, so essentially in a machine-readable format. And related to TAXI is STIX, which is short for Structured Threat Information Expression. It defines a common language for expressing cyber threat information. TAXI is designed specifically to support the transfer of STIX information. So STIX defines what is shared, the indicators etc. And taxi is the how sticks formatted messages are securely transferred between systems. So a threat feed that's machine consumable is typically transmitting STIX messages using taxi as the transmission mechanism. And taxi leverages HTTPS for secure transfer, and it supports a few different models, including a publisher-subscriber model, a mesh model, a peer-to-peer model. So the way taxi information can be exchanged depends on the scenario. And your SIEM, next-generation firewalls, and some IDPS solutions, intrusion detection and prevention, may actually ingest threat intelligence feeds. So those solutions can make better real-time decisions. There's predictive analysis, which leverages predictive intelligence. It's a mix of automation and human intelligence capabilities to optimize your cybersecurity program and gradually build capacity to predict and prevent attacks before they hit. Another good source of intelligence are threat maps. A cyber threat map, also known as a cyber attack map, is a real-time map of the computer security attacks that are going on at any given time. And you can actually find a good list of cyber threat maps from Fortinet, FireEye, and others in the top 8 cyber threat maps. Incidentally, you'll have direct access to all these links in the PDF that I publish for Domain 4. So every time I roll up a domain, I publish the PDF that goes along with that, so you can use those slides for your review. And the links in that PDF are all active and clickable. Then we have file and code repositories. Google searching code repositories on sources like GitHub can show you what threat actors are using, like you can find the full source code for Mimikatz, commonly used to dump password hashes on Windows systems. Do bear in mind, though, if you're using open source software for your business, know that hackers often review popular open source apps looking for vulnerabilities. So if you're even writing custom applications and you're leveraging open source libraries from around the internet, hackers have access to those too, and they're going to be poking around looking for ways in the door. Vendor websites are a good source of information because vendors often keep track of and publish their known vulnerabilities for their software. A lot of your vendors also have notification channels. They have a process so they can inform you immediately when a new vulnerability is discovered. Exactly how will vary by vendor, but they generally give you a way. Conferences are a great way to network with experts, to hear talks often based on the experience of others, and even hear from members of product teams taking an in-depth look at the security of their application or service. I can remember going to a Microsoft conference where I got to speak in depth with some of the original creators of Active Directory, for example. One of the original authors of a routing algorithm for the Exchange mail server. So if you do your research of who's who before you go to a conference, there's a good chance you can walk in the door of a big conference and get some face time with very knowledgeable and influential individuals. Academic journals can be a great source of information. You can often find research and information about attack types and how others have responded to or recovered from them. And they're available from a variety of government, education, and community sources. And they're often peer-reviewed, which is significant in that usually results in a higher quality product. If it's been peer-reviewed and approved, then you can expect that the information is reliable, generally speaking. A couple of good sources for academic journals include the Oxford Academic Journal of Cybersecurity and MDPI of Switzerland. Request for comments can be a good source. This is a publication in a series from the principal technical development and standard setting bodies for the Internet, most prominently the Internet Engineering Task Force. An RFC is authored by individuals or groups of engineers and computer scientists in the form of a memorandum describing methods, behaviors, research, or innovations applicable to the working of the Internet and Internet-connected systems. And the IETF adopts some of the protocols published in these RFCs as standards. However, many are informational or experimental in nature and not standards. So just make sure you know what you're looking at. But many RFCs have become official documents of Internet specifications, communication protocols that you're familiar with, procedures, and events. Now, if you don't have budget to go to a conference, you can learn from peers and experts in your own community. So certainly local industry groups where you can meet with local users who are cybersecurity experts. You can learn from your peers who have more experience than you do. Oftentimes these groups will get together and they'll have pizza and somebody will get up in front of the room and do a presentation on a specific topic. And if you go out to the Meetup website, which is meetup.com, you can definitely search and find local industry groups, user groups that are vendor agnostic or vendor specific if you like. Certainly you can go find a group that focuses on cloud security in AWS or Azure, or others that are more open and agnostic in terms of vendor. You can also look on social media. Hackers often publish recent vulnerabilities on Twitter. Security interest groups and certification study groups show up on LinkedIn all the time. And you're already familiar with learning content on YouTube, of which there is an abundance. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about penetration testing. And I want to start by just settling on the definition of what a penetration test is exactly. So first and foremost, it's an active test that attempts to exploit discovered vulnerabilities. The penetration tester, effectively an ethical hacker, often starts with reconnaissance and a vulnerability scan. They're looking at the attack surface, looking for vulnerabilities they can exploit. The tester will then attempt to bypass or actively test security controls to exploit the vulnerabilities they see. Once they exploit a system, they'll attempt privilege escalation techniques and lateral movement. So in other words, they'll try to increase their privilege on a single system and then try to move through other systems in the environment to spread their footprint, to crawl to the valuable assets. You may hear the word pivoting. That's the process of using an exploited system to access other systems. Now, let's talk for a minute about penetration testing versus vulnerability scanning. So these two sound pretty similar, but what's the difference exactly? I just want to lay their characteristics for you side by side here. So a vulnerability scan is a scan to identify weaknesses in your IT infrastructure. A penetration test is a more in-depth exam, similar to a simulated cyber attack. A vulnerability scan uses automated tools to scan systems for known vulnerabilities. A penetration test uses a combination of automated tools and manual techniques. The vulnerability scan reports the identified weaknesses and categorizes their severity, often with a CVE, which describes that vulnerability and its severity. A penetration tester is going to attempt to exploit vulnerabilities and assess their potential impact. A vulnerability scan may also suggest potential remediation steps. A penetration test helps you understand how vulnerable you are to real-world attacks and how much damage could be done. So if I were to express vulnerability scans and penetration tests as an analogy, think of a vulnerability scan like a fire alarm that warns you of a potential fire but doesn't say exactly where or how severe it is. A penetration test is like a firefighter testing the fire alarm and the sprinkler system. So the vulnerability scan is a scan to identify weaknesses where the penetration test is more in-depth. Vulnerability scan uses automated tools. The penetration test uses automated tools, but manual techniques leveraged by a skilled penetration tester. So a vulnerability scan is something almost anyone can do. You can run a vulnerability scan. You may not be able to interpret the report all that well, but anybody can run a vulnerability scan with a little training. A penetration test requires someone with special skills. A vulnerability scan is generally not intrusive. It can be. We talked about the potential of an intrusive scan. A penetration test, on the other hand, is intrusive and may be disruptive if we are not careful. Now let's talk about the types of penetration tests. So we have what's called a known environment test. This is where the tester is given a map of target systems and networks. They go into the test with substantial or full information of the target systems and networks. This is sometimes referred to as a white box test. That's a bit of a historical term, but you'll still see it. Unknown environment is where the pen tester knows nothing about the target systems and network. They go into the test completely blind, and they build out the database of everything they find as they go. It's sometimes called a blind test, often called a black box test. And I'm trying to give you equivalent terms here because you'll see both of these show up in some of the exam prep texts. There's the partially known environment where the tester has limited information, sometimes in the form of login credentials. This simulates the level of knowledge that a hacker with long-term access to a system would achieve through research and system footprinting. This is sometimes called a gray box test. And every penetration test should include a signed contract and rules of engagement. So the rules of engagement define the purpose of the test and what the scope will be for the people who are performing this test on the network. We need very clear expectations laid out ahead of time. They ensure everyone will be aware of what systems will be considered, the date and time, and any constraints around the test that all should be aware of. Again, captured in a signed legal contract. Now we're going to talk through some penetration testing techniques, beginning with passive and active reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is preliminary research about a target, so the active version interacts directly with the target in some way, and as such, the target, the customer, for example, the company, the organization the ethical hacker is targeting or the bad actor is targeting, may discover, record, or log those activities. For example, if they're scanning a public IP range they know that customer owns, that could be noticed by that customer's public-facing defenses. If they actively interrogate the company's corporate website trying to find vulnerabilities, that's going to be noticed. That's going to show up in a log. So footprinting is an ethical hacking technique used to gather as much data as possible about a specified target system, the infrastructure or networks, and to identify opportunities to penetrate them. Footprinting includes active and passive methods. So some active footprinting would include a ping sweep, trace route, nmap, extracting DNS information, all activities that are going to be logged in some fashion on the receiving end, the target's end. Passive footprinting. Browsing the target website, a Google search, performing a whois lookup, visiting some social media profiles. With some simple Google hacking called Google dorking, we can often find a lot of information out about a potential target, including a lot of the technologies they're using inside that organization for some of their core business services or even customer-facing applications. So as I mentioned, passive recon is one of not interacting directly with the target, and as such that target has no way of knowing, recording, or logging the activity. And much of the information gathered in passive reconnaissance is open source information because it's publicly available. It's data you can gather through any number of sources. There's actually a site that gives you a nice base of information that you can gather and tools for doing so at osintframework.com. In fact, I'll just show you that website quickly. It's actually pretty interesting if you've never seen it. So you go to osintframework.com and you click on the base node here, and it gives you a list of the types of information you might want to gather. Usernames, email addresses, instant messaging, search engines, digital currency, classified. So if you click through any of these, it's going to show you more and more detailed information until you get out to a tool or a website or some method to gather the information you're interested in. If you've never seen it and offensive security is of interest to you, or maybe you want to help your organization and look around to see what is publicly available, this is an interesting path to go down as an exploratory measure. Okay, and still in the vein of penetration testing concepts, I mentioned lateral movement. I just wanted to touch on a few basics here that I've mentioned previously. So lateral movement is gaining access to an initial system and then moving to other devices on the inside of the network. So moving laterally across the network, often beginning with client systems and attempting to move into server systems and crawling to more and more valuable assets. There's privilege escalation, which is a security hole created when code is executed with higher privileges than those of the user running it. generally a higher level account, but in some cases it's a horizontal privilege escalation where a user gains access to another user's resources. Then there's the concept of persistence. So in the context of penetration testing, it refers to the tester's ability to achieve a persistent presence on the exploited system long enough for a bad actor to gain in-depth access. The goal of persistence is to enable the ability to reconnect to the compromised host and to use it as a remote access tool. So persistent across reboots, for example. So there are some penetration testing exercise types that may come up as distractors on questions. I don't think you're going to be questioned on them directly, but I think they may show up in your potential answer choices, and I believe they show up in the glossary. So we have the red team, which is an internal or external entity dedicated to testing the effectiveness of a security program by emulating the tools and techniques of likely attackers in the most realistic way possible. So you'd consider the red team the offense. And then you have the blue team, which is an internal security team that defends against both real attackers and red teams. We'd call blue team defense. Oftentimes we'll have an exercise that involves a red team and a blue team in a game of capture the flag, for example. So these exercises are often intentional not just in testing the security of the organization, but building the skill of the teams who have to defend against attackers. You may have a purple team involved, so this exists to ensure and maximize the effectiveness of the red and blue teams. We think of the purple team as process improvement, and then the white team is responsible for oversight of an engagement or competition between a red team of mock attackers and a blue team of actual defenders. Think of the white team as the judge or referee. Not sure you'll see these directly on the exam, but base knowledge, fundamental information you should be aware of as a security professional. Because the larger the organization you're working in, the more likely it is there will be red team and blue teams and capture the flag type exercises. You should be familiar with the concept of responsible disclosure. So, responsible disclosure programs enable individuals and organizations to report security vulnerabilities or any weaknesses they've discovered to the affected software or application vendor. Meaning reporting it to the affected software or application vendor privately, presumably through a communication channel they have set up for that purpose. So when vulnerabilities are reported, the vendor receiving the report is expected to investigate and, if necessary, take appropriate steps to address the issue. The goal is to allow security issues to be addressed by the vendor before they are exploited by attackers or exposed to the public in any communication, ultimately improving overall security for everyone. Now, there have been occasions where ethical hackers responsibly disclose a vulnerability to a vendor and they do nothing about it, and after a period of time, 60 or 90 days, then they take it public. Which is unfortunate, but sometimes it happens, and those ethical hackers may strongly believe that it's necessary in the interest of transparency to that vendor's customers. Now, a bug bounty is a monetary award given to ethical hackers for successfully discovering and reporting a vulnerability or bug to the application's developer. Bug bounty programs allow companies to leverage the hacker community to improve security posture of their systems over time continuously. These bug bounty awards may be relatively small. Sometimes they are quite large, $10,000, $50,000, even $100,000 if the bug is significant in nature. But it behooves large software companies to set up responsible disclosure and bug bounty programs to make sure that they have the offensive security specialist in the security community on their side. Organizations may also rely on system and process audits, internal or external, which are used to assess the organization's compliance with industry standards, best practices, and corporate security policies. They typically review an organization's systems, processes, and procedures to identify areas of non-compliance or potential risk. And during the audit process, auditors may use a variety of tools and techniques to collect information. This could include technical tools like system scans, but also reviewing documentation, corporate policies, or even conducting interviews with employees. And these types of audits can identify issues beyond identifying simple technical vulnerabilities, including deficiencies in policies and security operations. And when we perform a vulnerability scan or a penetration test or an audit yields a finding, we need to confirm that finding. So with a vulnerability scan, for example, it assesses possible security vulnerabilities in computers, networks, and equipment. And here it's very important that we confirm the vulnerability is in fact true. So if we find a false positive, this is where the scan believes there's a vulnerability, but when physically checked, it's not there. It could be a false reading in the vulnerability scanner. It could be that you were performing an unauthenticated scan, so it came to an errant conclusion due to simple lack of access. Now we have a false negative where there is a vulnerability, but the scanner does not detect it. A true positive, this is where the results of the system scan agree with the manual inspection, with the confirmation process. But following a vulnerability scan, it's important that we review the log files and the reports that list any potential vulnerabilities to identify their veracity. So when we know those findings are indeed true, then we can move into the process of prioritizing our remediation efforts. Now, earlier in our session, I've mentioned common vulnerabilities and exposures, the CVE, and the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS. So I want to just unpack that with you here briefly. So the CVSS is the overall score assigned to a vulnerability. It indicates the severity, and it's used by many vulnerability scanning tools. I would say it's the most common method today. The CVE is a list of all publicly disclosed vulnerabilities that includes the CVE ID for a specific vulnerability, a description, dates, and comments. The CVSS score is not reported in the CVE listing. You have to use the National Vulnerability Database to find the assigned CVSS score. The CVE list feeds into that National Vulnerability Database. That National Vulnerability Database is actually maintained by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it is synchronized with the MITRE CVE list I mentioned earlier. Now let's talk about vulnerability classification. This is the process of categorizing vulnerabilities based on their severity and potential impact, and it helps prioritize remediation efforts and effective allocation of our resources to the most important functions. There are several vulnerability classification systems, but the most widely used is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, the CVSS, which assigns a score from 0 to 10, so least severe to most severe is that score. And it includes three primary metrics: exploitability, so basically how easy is it to exploit the vulnerability; the impact, what kind of damage can an attacker cause if they exploit the vulnerability; and the scope, to what systems or assets does the vulnerability apply. And so as one might guess, easily exploitable, high impact exploits with a broad scope would be those that would get the highest score. And next we have exposure factor, which is the percentage of value an asset lost due to an incident. So it's the portion of an asset that an organization expects would be damaged if a risk materializes. So for example, we have a building worth $1 million. It is estimated a tornado will result in 30% damage or loss. That's $300,000, so our exposure factor is 30% there. In this case, a likely response is insurance. It's transferring the risk to the insurance company. Environmental variable shows up on the syllabus as well. These are the specific circumstances and factors within an organization's environment that can impact the severity, likelihood, or risk associated with a particular vulnerability. So let's go through a few environmental variables just to give you some context here for exam day. There's asset criticality, so the importance of the affected system. The network topology can factor, so the layout and configuration of the organization's network and access controls, which can influence the potential impact of a vulnerability. If a system is isolated to a specific network segment, if it's not connected to the public internet, then the impact is going to be much different than a public-facing internet-connected system. Data sensitivity, so the level of confidentiality, integrity, and availability required for the data stored or processed by the affected system. The user base, the number and type of users accessing the vulnerable system, as well as their privileges and access rights. So we're going to be more concerned with assets used by a large number of users and potentially more concerned about assets that are used by our employees that are involved in customer-facing operations. Continuing down the list, we have external dependency, so reliance on third-party services, vendors, or partners that may be affected by a vulnerability. The threat landscape, the current state of threats, including the prevalence of attacks exploiting the specific vulnerability and the likelihood of the organization being targeted. So if we have information from one of our threat intelligence feeds that tells us that the current version of a specific software package we're using is vulnerable to a threat that is being actively exploited, we're going to have our guard up. And it may prompt us to move to take additional measures and to put additional security controls in place. There are operational constraints, so the organization's ability to implement remediation measures, considering factors like maintenance windows and potential disruption to business processes. And regulatory requirements, so industry-specific or general data protection and security regulations that the organization must comply with, like GDPR for customers in the EU, HIPAA for healthcare-related information, PCI DSS for credit card processors. Next on our list is risk tolerance. So risk tolerance, sometimes called risk appetite, is the amount of risk a company is willing to accept. Risk tolerance and risk appetite are often used interchangeably, though risk appetite generally speaks to risk in the aggregate and risk tolerance speaks to risk on a per individual risk basis. Should it come up on the exam, you can consider these terms as equivalent. So two ways to say the same thing. And regulations can affect our risk tolerance as well. So regulations addressing data privacy and security that might influence an organization's tolerance and security posture would include GDPR, which applies to any company with customers in the EU, Sarbanes-Oxley, which applies to all publicly traded companies in the United States, HIPAA, which applies to companies working with protected health information, and credit card processors are subject to PCI DSS regulations. And based on our risk tolerance in an organization, we will respond to risk differently. There are 4 responses to risk I want to introduce you to here. The first is risk acceptance, where the organization does nothing and they accept the risk and the potential loss if the threat occurs. If the risk is low and the potential loss is small, acceptance is a likely path. There's risk mitigation, which you do by implementing a countermeasure and accepting the residual risk. That is the risk that remains after the mitigation is in place. So risk mitigation is the act of reducing risk. In risk transference, the organization will transfer or assign the risk to a third party, such as by purchasing insurance against damage, such as a cyber insurance policy or a policy to protect a building in the event of a natural disaster like a hurricane or tornado. Risk avoidance happens when the cost of mitigating or accepting risks are higher than the benefits of the service, in which case the organization avoids implementing that service that would expose them to that unacceptable risk. So with that in mind, let's move on to vulnerability response and remediation. So here we're talking about the process of eliminating vulnerabilities discovered in the vulnerability scan. So responses would include patching, so software patches or updates that correct OS and application vulnerabilities. And firmware patches and driver updates address hardware vulnerabilities. We have insurance, where we purchase a policy to provide payment for replacement in the event a risk is realized or the vulnerability exploited. So that is transferring the risk, which we just discussed. Segmentation is another potential response, so placing the system that's impacted on an isolated segment to reduce external exposure. Another approach is compensating control. So this is a secondary or supporting security control that prevents the vulnerability from being exploited. So for example, we can use secure coding practices to avoid SQL injection exploits, which impact systems where we don't have proper input validation on our forms. When we've neglected those secure coding practices, we can implement a web application firewall as a backup to protect against that SQL injection attack. You may recall from our earlier discussion, a web application firewall typically implements an OWASP core rule set that protects against those common top 10 web application exploits, which includes SQL injection. So in this case, the WAF is a supporting or backup control because we missed that first line of defense. And exception or exemption is the last option on the response list in the syllabus, which is allowing a vulnerable system to continue to operate without doing anything to address the problem. This is effectively risk acceptance, and is a decision that must be weighed very carefully. We don't want to accept risks that are too high or too meaningful to the organization to fail to address. Next, we have validation of remediation, which ensures the identified vulnerabilities have been effectively addressed and that the chosen mitigation has actually eliminated the security weakness. So a very common response is rescanning. So the security tools are often used to rescan the affected system after the remediation steps are completed to see if it triggers the discovery of the vulnerability on the second scan. Another validation option is audit. This is an in-depth examination of the remediation process and documentation that may well involve review of the chosen mitigation strategy as well. So where rescanning just ensures we have closed the gap in terms of what the vulnerability was, the audit process may also examine how we chose to close the gap. And verification. This is actively testing the system to see if the vulnerability can still be exploited. As you might imagine, rescanning is far and away the most common response. Fastest, easiest, generally accurate, though the least thorough of the lot. And that brings us to the last phase of the vulnerability lifecycle, which is reporting. Communicating the findings, actions taken, and lessons learned to relevant stakeholders within the organization. This ensures that decision makers are informed about the actions we've taken and their impact to the current security posture. It details any trends, patterns, or vulnerable areas requiring further attention. We may offer recommendations for improvements based on findings and our experiences throughout the life cycle, but it closes the communication loop and completes the vulnerability lifecycle. And that brings us to the end of section 4.3. I hope you're getting value out of the series as always. If you have questions, leave me a comment below the video, reach out directly on LinkedIn. I'll look forward to seeing you back here for section 4.4 in the next day or two. And until next time, take care and stay safe.